Hey guys, we're going to go ahead and take a look at some atypical vertebrae. They're not atypical because they're weird or strange or anything like that. They don't, well, I guess the best way of saying it is they have some structures that don't fit into what we would see on a typical vertebrae. So if you remember our typical vertebra drawing where we talked about the body and the pedicles and the lamina and the spinous process, uh, these don't all have all of the structures, and they actually may have some new structures that we haven't learned before. So let's jump in with the first atypical vertebra, which is C1. It is so unique that it has its own special name, Atlas. And man, this is such a good name for a vertebrate. It's just a cool name. Atlas was, I don't know exactly, so forgive me if you happen to be a historian or mythologian or something like that. But I'm fairly sure that Atlas was a Greek or a Roman god who the legend about him was that he held up the world on his shoulders. And if you've ever been to a rainforest cafe, you've seen Atlas holding up the world. Or if you've ever seen a cover of a book called Atlas Shrugged, or I'm sure there's probably a couple other places where you may have seen Atlas, but he's usually depicted as this big guy in good shape, um, holding up Earth. Anyway, that's kind of what this vertebra does for us. It holds up our world. It holds up our head. So our skull actually sits on top of this vertebra. And if you remember the occipital condyles, they articulate with this vertebra. So we'll take a look at that. So the first structure on here worth taking a look at, they're all worth taking a look at, sorry. The first structure on our list is the anterior arch. And that anterior arch is right here. Now, what strikes you about this? What is it missing that typical vertebrae have? There's no vertebral body. The vertebral body is absent. We just have this ring, and this arch is a part of that ring. Anterior arch. And if it might be tough to see here, but there's just a little bump right there. That's called the anterior tubercle. Now, unfortunately, we can't see this neck structure in this view. We'll be able to see it really well when we do our 3D video, but there's this nice little depression right here that's very smooth. And that articulates with a structure called the dens, which comes off of C2, which will be our next slide. And when you look left and right, the dens is spinning against the structure, or rather, I guess, your C1 is spinning on dens. There are some pretty interesting looking transverse processes here. Transverse processes. And there's the transverse foramen. If you remember, C1 through C7 C1 through C6 have a transverse foramen for the vertebral artery. Now, the articular facets are pretty interesting looking. If you remember, the occipital condyle sort of looked like a kidney bean. Well, the superior articular facets of C1 kind of look like a kidney bean because they articulate with the occipital condyles. So superior articular facet. I should get more creative with my colors. Inferior articular facet we'll have to wait to get a good view of until we use our 3D video because they're underneath here. This is a superior view, so they're in the same location approximately, they're just underneath. They actually look a little bit different. They're more circle shaped. So if you're trying to figure out what side's the top and what side is the bottom of C1, the kidney bean facets, those are your superior facets. Let's go ahead and label our posterior arch. And the posterior tubercle. We'll use, I guess, this purple posterior tubercle. So you may notice something else here. There's no spinous process. This little bump isn't dramatic enough to be called a spinous process, I guess. We call it a posterior tubercle. Another unique structure to C1. And then the vertebral canal isn't unique to C1, but let's go ahead and label it vertebral canal. If these blue arrows are confusing to you, you can erase them, but I just wanted you to know where your inferior articular facet is. Okay, that's it for C1. Let's keep going. We're going to go down to C2. So C2 is sometimes called axis because your head moves around the axis that is the dens or the odontoid process drawn right here. We can go ahead and label that right off the bat. So here is dens. Or the odontoid process. You can use either. Let's just go with dens. If I put this into a quiz, I'll be keen the answer is dens. If you put odontoid process, I'll catch it when I review your quiz, but just put dens and save yourself the worry when you get something marked wrong at first by the computer quiz. The body, so there is a body, unlike C1. C2 does have a body. And then the pedicles are right here. There are transverse processes as well. Oops, kind of unique looking. And because it's C1 through C6, there's going to be a transverse foramen as well. All right, we have a superior articular facet. I hope you're more creative with your color choices than me. I'm kind of limited. You will see that I wouldn't use the same color as dens. I don't want you to confuse those two, so probably use a different color. But you can see that these are in the transverse plane. Remember, facets in the cervical spine are in the transverse plane. You can kind of see the inferior articular facet here, and you can see the back side of it here. The actual articulating area is going to be around the corner. But anyway, inferior articular facet. And then here we have the lamina. And you do have a spinous process. Remember, C1 didn't. And then all the cervical vertebrae that have a spinous process, or most, I should say, have a bifid spinous process. That's something that's unique to some cervical vertebrae. So you have this bifid spinous process. And I don't know why that says 1. Let me get rid of that. And then lastly, you have the vertebral canal, which is right there. This is kind of at an angle, so you can't see it very well, but it is there. And that brings us to C4. And then that will be our last atypical cervical vertebrae. Body, we have a body. Now these aren't on your list here, but this has these high edges to the body called uncinate processes that make it look a little different. Pedicles. Pedicle in this case is right here. It's pretty small. Transverse process. Now these are kind of some interesting transverse processes here. They have 2 tubercles on them. We have an anterior tubercle, so that's going to be the front one. And we have a posterior tubercle behind it. And because it's between C1 and C6, it has a transverse foramen that holds our vertebral artery. We have some articular facets just like the other vertebrae in the transverse plane because it's cervical. We can't see the inferior facets because they're underneath. We'll see that in the other video. We have some lamina here. We have that unique bifid spinous process that only can be found in our cervical region. We have our vertebral canal that's ovoid because it is a cervical vertebra. And then last but not least, it's unique to this this vertebrae. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and erase the pedicle and the cell body. You don't need to do that on yours. Hopefully you're cleaner than I was. But I'm going to draw it in with this green color right here. Now this is much easier to see on the real thing, but there's actually a groove right here that allows our C5 spinal nerve to exit the spinal cord. All right, that's it for C4. Brings us to T5. This should look pretty familiar. It looks a lot like our typical vertebrae. As a body, we've actually used, I think, this photo before. Here's the body. Here are the pedicles, and again, you can even draw the pedicles like this if you want, like it's a circle around the whole thing. Pedicles, transverse process, transverse process. Now here's where it starts to get a little different. Now we can color in this costotransverse facet. This is a facet for a rib. And there's one here as well. We can go ahead and label the demifacet, the superior demifacet. We can sort of see it here, and then we can see it really well here. That's half of a facet for a rib. And then we have our inferior down below. That's an inferior articular facet. Superior vertebral notch and inferior vertebral notch. So it's getting a little repetitive. I know you've seen these. Sorry, guys. So there's superior. You can label it here as well. And then inferior, we'll use dark green, I guess. And it's right there. Then we have some lamina. Oops, I drew it kind of big there, but oh well, you get the idea. And then a spinous process. Oops. And then the vertebral canal. And that's it for T5. I think the reason why that's included here as an atypical vertebra is because of these demifacets and costotransverse facets. So that's unique. Not all vertebrae have those. And that brings us to our lumbar vertebra. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. It has a large vertebral body. Lumbar vertebrae have big vertebral bodies. They're holding up all of our weight above our low back. Then we have pedicles here. We have a different looking transverse process from the thoracic spine. There's no rib. Oops. So we don't need as well. Why can't I change colors? Here we go. So there's a transverse process, superior articular facet. These facets are in the sagittal plane. Remember, lumbar facets are in the sagittal plane. I mean, you can tell they're a little They're a little off. It's like almost 45 degrees off from the sagittal plane, but it's close. So there's the sagittal plane. I'm sorry, there's the superior articular facet. The inferior articular facet you can't see because look at this. So you can see this facet is sort of facing in. And again, let's say this is a sagittal plane. It's pretty close to that, but it's facing in. It's facing the spinous process. So that means that the inferior facets are going to be facing out because they connect to the superior facet below. So you can see it. There it is, inferior articular facet. I'm going to go ahead and erase this so I don't confuse you. Mammillary process, that's a new structure. So right here, it's easier to see on the real thing. You can actually appreciate it a little bit more. Specifically right here, you'll see it kind of sticking out sometimes. That's the mammillary process. The accessory process can be tougher to see. They've actually drawn it pretty nice here. It doesn't always look quite that large. That is the accessory process. It has superior vertebral notches and inferior vertebral notches, just like our thoracic vertebra. So here's a superior vertebral notch, and here is an inferior vertebral notch. The inferior vertebral notch is bigger, just like the thoracic vertebrae. Then we have lamina. So here's some lamina. We have a spinous process, just like the thoracic region and most of the cervical vertebrae. That's just a singular spinous process, so it's not bifid. That's just cervical that has a bifid spinous process. And then lastly, we have the vertebral canal, much smaller than the cervical vertebral canal and is almost triangular shaped, whereas the cervical vertebra had a ovoid vertebral canal. And that brings us to the sacrum. The sacrum is very unique. First of all, it has bodies, not a body. So there are 5 fused sacral vertebrae. That's the coccyx down below. The sacral promontory is right here. And this actually forms a part of your pelvic brim, which we'll talk about later. But there's this ring within your pelvis, and this is a part of it, sacral promontory. It's just the front part of that front lip on the top of that first body. It has superior articular facets. It has one pair of facets right here that articulate with L5. And then you can't really see them here, but the sacral ala is not necessarily an exact science, but here it is. It's a wing like that, and they kind of look like wings, I guess. A sacral ala. Now, auricular surface, we don't have a great view of. We can label it, but it's not great. We would really want a lateral view. Anyone who's ever had SI pain, this is where a lot of that pain is probably coming from right here. It's part of a joint with your ilium. It's called your SI joint, where your sacrum and your ilium touch. Anyway, that's called your auricular surface. If you look at it from a lateral view, which we will do when we get to the 3D model videos, it sort of looks like an ear shape, kind of, and that's what auricle means. It's ear. So auricular surface, it's an ear-shaped surface. Ventral and dorsal foramina. Ventral is an old word. It actually comes from animal anatomy. A better word for ventral would be anterior. Anyway, here they are. These are foramina for sacral nerves. Those are ventral. And then we have dorsal foramina, which again means posterior. So we have some dorsal foramina right there. Now we have a few crusts, and this gets, you have to use your imagination a little bit. The idea here is that these are 5 fused vertebrae, and vertebrae typically have a spinous process, a transverse process, and in the case of lumbar vertebrae, they actually have mammillary and accessory processes. So the thought is if these are all fused together, they sort of leave marks. And that's really easy to see for the median crust. The other two you have to get a little creative. So you can kind of imagine that this crest right here is from fused spinous processes. Even the lateral crest you typically see pretty well. It's right here. And then the intermediate crest, not quite so easy to see. It's kind of in the area of the foramina. So don't obscure the foramina, but anyway, intermediate crest. Now the sacral hiatus is cool. This is where some of your nerves are coming out at the bottom of your quada equina, which is something that comes off the end of your spinal cord. Your spinal cord actually stops at L1, which most people don't realize. But nerves continue all the way down here to your sacral hiatus or sacral canal. Which brings us to our last structure, the coccyx. And there's not a ton to label here, so there is the articular facet for the S5 vertebral body. We have some cornua, which are horns. And we have some transverse processes. And this is just 3 fused coccygeal vertebrae. Hello, I want yellow. There we go. Transverse processes. And cornua. Guys, that is it. We looked at C1, C2, C4, T5, L3, the sacrum, and the coccyx. See you in the next video. Thanks. Bye.